So if you participated in Advent of Tess this year, then you'll know these patterns pretty intimately. And I know that everybody is coming into Advent of Tess with a huge range of skill levels, from never even folded a tessellation before to already designing your own tessellations. And some people are even coming in with very little origami experience at all. So I want to give a set of recommendations based on how far you got in Advent of Tess as to what kind of projects would be good to work on next if you want to continue learning origami tessellations. And I'll start with if you struggled with the first week, or the first 5 rather, these patterns where we're focusing on 3-way intersections of pleats, closed and open triangle twists, using those twists in different structures and building up either more open twists or more times flipping the paper. If you struggled with these patterns and didn't progress to the next set, then I'd recommend going back to Tessellation Foundations, to these sets of patterns where we're working with pleats mostly and with pleat intersections, and getting into a little bit of basic twists, but really working on understanding the pleats and then building to larger projects, including a Clover Fujimoto tessellation and more repeats of the first day of Advent of Tess. You can see this is the same exact motif in these 2 pieces. Going through Tessellation Foundations, in that case where you really struggled with the first 5 patterns of Advent of Tess, it's going to give you the foundation to then come back and be able to learn more twists like the hexagons and rhombus twists and the hybrid hexagons, while having a strong understanding of what pleats do and how they interact. So if you're a very beginner and maybe you haven't even attempted the first day of Advent of Tess, then Tessellation Foundations, and the links for everything that I'm recommending are in the description below. Tessellation Foundations is the way to build the basic skills of origami tessellations so you can then step into more challenging patterns. Then, as we get into the hexagon twists and the rhombus twists, if you're struggling with those basic twists, getting the closed hexagon to fold correctly, getting the open hexagon set up with the right pleats, getting the rhombus twist set up with the right pleats, then I'd recommend practicing those particular twists. And that is exactly what I focus on inside of Basic Twists Bootcamp. So in Basic Twists Bootcamp, there's 10 recorded lessons where we go over one twist and then how to practice it in a broader pattern, just on its own, for the ones that can be practiced on their own, which is closed and open square, closed and open equilateral triangle. These twists can be practiced on your own, and you can see in the lesson here, I numbered which twist we did when, so it's easier to follow what was going on. And getting a handle on both the right-handed and the left-handed forms of each of these twists is really crucial, because in these other patterns, you might be seeing a right-handed, well, typically with the hexagons, you're only seeing right-handed, except for these more advanced days. But with the triangles and the rhombus twists, in here, you might be seeing a right-handed or a left-handed triangle or rhombus. So it's important to be able to practice both. And once you get into the hexagons, you can't do a pattern with all just hexagon twists very easily. You would need isoarea hexagon twist, and that's an advanced twist, so it doesn't really belong in a basic practice session. But you can still practice the closed hexagon with many repeats on the same paper, and the open hexagon with many repeats on the same paper. And then the Basic Twist Bootcamp also includes the closed right triangle twist with 2 different patterns that use this right triangle, and it's 2 different structures. So when we're looking at an origami tessellation, it's not just this kind of medallion, this flower, but it's in a structure that allows it to repeat forever. And so when we get through the right triangles and into the rhombus twists, we're actually going to see this pattern here is in the same structure as several of our Advent of Tess pieces. And so this is the capstone project for Basic Twist Bootcamp. It has closed hexagon, triangle, and rhombus twists in this hex, tri, rhomb, tri structure. And so when you learn the order of the twists that go into this pattern, you can apply that to other choices of twists in the same structure. And that's how I can know how to fold a bunch of different patterns that I've never folded before, just by internalizing these structures and saying, okay, this is how that repeats. So if you're struggling with the basic twists, the closed and open, hexagon, triangle, rhombus, in the case of Basic Twist Bootcamp, then you want to be practicing those twists and learning a bit more about how these patterns repeat. And that is what's taught in Basic Twist Bootcamp. And if you want to take that to the next level, then there's also Tessellation Starter Sequence. So while Basic Twist Bootcamp had 10 lessons, or has 10 lessons rather, Tessellation Starter Sequence has 50. And it covers basically the same range of difficulty. I'm going to flip these so we're starting from the easier end. And it actually goes a little bit easier than Basic Twist Bootcamp. You can see one of the same exercises from Tessellation Foundations, 2 of the same exercises actually, of looking at these pleat overlaps and these square pleat intersections. And the main focus in Tessellation Starter Sequence is helping you learn to read crease patterns and to see from the crease pattern, where am I going to start? How am I going to continue around? And what does that mean for what twist needs to be folded when? And that includes patterns where you flip over between each twist, and patterns with unusual spacing. So this particular pattern I teach as an exercise in the move that you'll see over and over in these square twist tessellations with with twists that are next to each other on opposite sides of the paper. And that's a move called pleat reordering. So switching which pleat passes through a particular space first. And that's something that we don't see quite as much in Advent of Tess because we're using all triangle grids, and in the triangle grids we'll see more of triangle wraps and compound triangle wraps, but the pleat reordering is another move that is useful in these situations. So in Tessellation Starter Sequence, we'll typically see more repeats and more examples of similar patterns than we see in Basic Twists Bootcamp. And I mean, if you've done Advent of Tess, you know my teaching style. In Tessellation Starter Sequence, what I'm really trying to emphasize is how to read the crease patterns, how to fold more repeats of a given pattern. And also looking at where are the symmetry locations? How can I use the information I can find in the crease pattern about the symmetry to fold new and more interesting patterns? How can I use spacing in interesting ways? Like, we've seen 3 tessellations so far that use this same kind of structure. So the green one is everything fully spaced far apart. The blue one is one direction spaced far apart and the other direction spaced closely. And the pink one is alternating for each gap between twists. Is it close or far, close or far, close or far? In both directions. Like, there's a lot of different things that you can learn based on these different patterns. And then we can take that same group of twists, and instead of spacing them to get to the next repeats, we can mirror them to create a whole new pattern. So that's just the square twist lessons in Tessellation Starter Sequence. Then we get into the triangle grid and triangle twist lessons, where we have the pleat intersections first, and then the triangle twists with them more spaced out or closer together. And we can have a different challenge, a different texture around the edge if we change how our grid is oriented relative to the edge. So there's a little bit of advanced gridding that goes into Tessellation Starter Sequence as well. And getting into, okay, we're mixing the closed and the open twists. We're changing the spacing in some directions, but not others. We're doing that in another way where it's radial. And then we start getting into these triangle twists on both sides of the paper, closed and open on both sides. Having closed and open on the same side, but instead of alternating, having these groups of 4 twists. And then doing that with more repeats on a grid that's particular to this tessellation. And yeah, getting into all kinds of different variations. And you can see through those variations, the same structure holds. Like, all of the square twists used the same structure and pretty much the same order of folding the twists. The triangle twist tessellations used the same structure and the same order of folding the tessellations. We're just changing what symmetries we're using, and that makes these different patterns appear very different. Likewise with the hexagon twists. You can learn the basic, and then you can learn a very close variation where we've just swapped these closed triangles for open triangles, and see how that impacts the pattern as a whole. And actually, this is one that we did in Advent of Tess this year. And then we can get into variations with the open hexagons and putting twists on both sides of the paper, and doing that same thing again but this time with open triangle twists. And you can really start to see with this repetition how every time we fold these patterns, we're using the same order of folding. And that means that no matter what pattern you use, as long as it's a hexagon surrounded by 6 triangles, even if that next hexagon is different, I'm going to use the same sequence of steps to fold. First the center, and then these 6 triangles, and then those 6 hexagons and the triangles between them. And as I get further out, it's not about going, okay, these 6 that are exactly the same. It's, okay, I'm going to add a hexagon. I need to add 2 triangles to make it fit in. Then the next hexagon, I need to add 2 more triangles. Next hexagon, 2 more triangles. And getting into the rhombus twists, you can see the Basic Twist Bootcamp lessons are showing up in Tessellation Starter Sequence as well, but there's always more examples. In this case, patterns with only rhombus and triangle twists. And then getting into that capstone project from Basic Twist Bootcamp, but taking it further by saying, okay, but what if the hexagon twist is on the other side of the paper? What if the triangle twist is on the other side from the hexagon and rhombus? What if the rhombus twist is on the other side relative to the hexagon and triangle? And that's another one that we saw in Advent of Tess this year. And then we get into, well, what if the rhombus is the one connecting to the hexagon instead of the triangle? And we have various examples of that. And what if that rhombus is directly connected, but it's not acting as a position of symmetry, where we have the same thing on opposite sides of every rhombus, but instead is part of a broader pattern where we're repeating these whole chunks. Again, not as chunks themselves, but as twists that we add around the center and then add more around the center and more around the center. And that's maxing out the complexity in Tessellation Starter Sequence for the rhombus twists. Then we get into the right triangle twists. Some of the same lessons as Basic Twist Bootcamp, but also additional lessons where these twists are on both sides of the paper. And then this is getting into using square twists with right triangle twists and the many different ways that you can do that. Those 2 are in one structure, and then these final 2 lessons are in a different structure that still uses square and right triangle twists. So if you're struggling with the second set of 5, or frankly, if you're struggling to repeat these patterns on bigger grids, so these were on 24 divisions. If you want to fold them on 48 and get the repeats, if you're struggling with that, then I would really recommend learning both the foundations of the twists themselves and also the foundations of the structures that we're using. So these hexagons and triangles, I call it hexagons and triangles 6-fold because there's 6 of the same around the hexagon, or the hex tri rhomb tri structure that we also see for these 2 patterns. Those structures, and folding many examples of those structures are going to make it a lot easier to fold than new examples of the same structure. So this one we saw was in Tessellation Starter Sequence, and this one's a close variation on the pattern taught in both Basic Twist Bootcamp and Tessellation Starter Sequence. And having those lessons is going to allow you to then move into these patterns that are not part of those courses. So one other thing that's really helpful if you're wanting to fold more repeats of the patterns is the Advent of Tess ebook. This is a digital book, and let me go ahead and pull it up on my screen. You can find it at gatheringfolds.com. Again, all the links are in the video description. And it has not only each day's crease pattern on 64 grid divisions, but also alternate endings. So each of these patterns that we fold a small portion of, like let's say nudge, for example, this is day 11 of Advent of Tess, but knowing the hex tri rom tri structure and knowing what twists are used in nudge does not tell you all the different ways that the pattern can be repeated. It just tells you the simplest way that the pattern can be repeated. And so if we look here in the contents for day 11, we have nudge, showcase, and exhibition. And those are 3 different ways of continuing the pattern with the start that we learned in Advent of Tess. And so we're able to see some tips in here. And this is actually a diagram that I made for Tessellation Starter Sequence. And I believe that one is also. And we're really looking at these structures as, okay, there's some twist that we're starting with, and then we're adding a layer of twists around, then the next layer of twists around, and the next layer of twists around, and getting to these repeats where the particular twists might, like these, each of these hexagons might or might not be a repeat of the center. Like we saw in the second and third pattern with hexagons and triangles. The next twists out, those 6 hexagons in the first ring around the center, don't have to be the same as the twist in the center. And that's something that I go into in these tilings. So before I get there, let's take a look. There's some more advice here about, okay, with these structures, and this one in particular is the structure for days 13 and 14, that is going to have different behavior because we're not having these rings around the center exactly at the boundaries of these twist tiles. It's something else going on. It's a lot more complicated. And so we can get into some pretty complicated stuff, even though the central area was relatively straightforward to fold. And then for some patterns, you can space everything further apart. And that's particularly helpful for the last 4 days or so, because those patterns are really dense together. And yeah, it's easier to fold when you can actually have space to touch the pleats going between twists. So in this next section of the ebook, I go over all of the different tilings, all the different symmetry structures, and all the different arrangements of shapes that are used by patterns in the Advent of Tess series and the alternate endings in this ebook. So we have clusters of 4 triangles, clusters of 6, and clusters of 4. And that one I'm going to do a tutorial on in the coming weeks. And there's alternating hexagons and triangles. There's hexagons and triangles where the next ring around the center is in a position of 3-fold rotational symmetry. There's hexagons and triangles where the next hexagon is in a position of twofold rotational symmetry. And that's what we see in the hybrid hexagon twists when we're using the twofold hybrids with funnel weaver, wandering compasses, greenhouse, and inlaid. That's the structure that those are built around. And then there's symmetries where the that next hexagon around is not in a position of rotational symmetry. So like clematis, carnation, mayapple, those last 3 days. And then the alternate endings can choose to use this symmetry even though the that next hexagon out could have been in a position of symmetry. So some of the alternate endings get into that also. And you get into some further symmetries. Then we have the hexagons and triangles threefold tiling. We've got some threefold symmetries for the hexagons and triangles sixfold tiling. That's looking actually at hazard discs, day 16, the first day with the hybrid hexagon twists, is in this structure. So it's still folded in the same order, but the twists are acting as different positions of symmetry. And then another example of things folded in the same order, but the twists are acting as different positions of symmetry. This is the symmetry used for the hex-tri, rom-tri tiling in general, like nudge. And then this is the symmetry used for showcase and the symmetry used for exhibition. And there's other examples that use this first symmetry extension in the tiling as well. And I mention the names of the pieces, so nebulae and showcase are the ones that use this symmetry. And then you can do other crazy things with it. You can have 2 rhombus twists between each pair of hexagons instead of just 1. There's a lot of ways to repeat these patterns that are less straightforward than you would imagine. And then with enveloped, enveloped and inchworm, we have this hex double rom tri tiling that enables it, and then you can morph that into the hex quad rom tri. And there's this rhombus ladder pattern that also works, and this hex double rom tri expansion for a jewelry shop. Like there's so many different options when it gets into these crazy ways of repeating things, like the galaxies tiling. And in our folding of it, we actually stop at this ring for Andromeda, and that's having this rhombus filling in for this corner of the next hexagon. But we can also repeat it with that being a rhombus, and that makes cosmic fission. So yeah, it's a whole other set of challenges to then take these Advent of Tess patterns and fold them with more repeats, getting into these structures and how they work together. I also have, some advice on how to choose your grid. And then the patterns themselves in the ebook, you get to see the PDF from Advent of Tess with the 1 repeat. And then it gets into, okay, what is this like with more repeats? And the crease pattern for that, and a skeleton diagram. Now the skeleton doesn't make as much sense in patterns where you're only using intersections of pleats. In this particular one, I put the dots at the intersection of folds, like either mountains or valleys, on the side that I would recommend folding that intersection. So there's a bit of extra information in there. And then you can see, okay, the same motif for daisy lattice is fitting in a different way with this triangle twist, actually connecting these tubes, and we get a whole other structure. It's still functionally an equilateral triangles tiling because it's all three-way intersections of pleats, but you get to see that other side of things. And then dancing triangles. You see the amount that we folded for Advent of Tess, and then you see that in the context, so with photos of more repeats and in the context of a repeating pattern. And if you're in the middle of it, it's functionally an infinitely repeating pattern. You can see how each chunk of it is acting in the broader pattern without the border of the paper being so close in. So that's my recommendation for if you enjoyed the Advent of Tess patterns and you want a bit more challenge. Go ahead and try and fold them with more repeats. And the ebook is really helpful if you are having trouble seeing, like, okay, for this one, we do see what's on the opposite side of the rhombus. But this one, for example, if you're having trouble seeing in your head, okay, the next triangle twist needs to go there at the corner because that's where it is on the other side of the rhombus, then the ebook will be really helpful for helping place each of those twists. And last but not least, if you're getting into these hybrid hexagon twists and really enjoying them, then I have a couple resources that can help you get into the designer mindset and start learning to design and fold pretty much any pattern you want. And that's Tessellations by Tiles and Tessellation Academy. So I have right here some examples of tutorials I've been teaching inside of Tessellation Academy, which is a little bit more into the repeats of inchworm. And this other crazy pattern, I forget what I call it, like floating cubes or tumbling blocks something or another. But yeah, we can get into some really crazy stuff, and these two are actually in the same structure. This is not just a blank space, it's a massive hexagon twist. And this actually is a pattern that we designed in Tessellation Academy. Hola, Zach. And we're able to say, like, okay, we've got this pattern with squares connecting to right triangles, and these pleats going out are a certain distance apart, and let's see if we can find another pattern of squares connecting to right triangles that has that same distance. And we were able to, and we came up with this really cool pattern that looks a lot like quilt blocks. So we named it Champion Quilt. And we can look at, okay, what patterns are known for this structure, and where are the gaps in that, and what are the choices we would need to make to fill in the gaps in the known patterns in the structure. So for this case, we were working in the hexagons and triangles two-fold tiling, where you see the same thing on two sides of the hexagon. And we said, okay, there's this gap for open hexagons on one side and open triangles on the other. Open hexagons on one side and closed triangles on the other was a pattern that I'd made before called interlocking hearts. But this particular pattern hadn't been made. And then we also looked at open hexagons and open triangles on the same side of the paper. And then we looked at, well, how can we create variations in this pattern? And this would be changing the pleats on both the top and bottom of these hexagon twists, and get into the hybrid hexagon twists in this structure. That's cool. And then we've also worked, so this would be the basic tutorial, the beginner tutorial for that month of Advent of Tess, of Tessellation Academy. All of these names start running together a bit, where we're talking about, okay, in general, for these patterns, how do we fold them? We start in the center, we do this stripe, not the stripe of hexagons that are directly connected to each other, but the stripe perpendicular to that, where we have all of our pleats heading out. And then we do the next stripe and the next. So there's a ton of different options. Like these are all pieces I made for tutorials for Tessellation Academy, where I'm explaining not only how to fold that particular tessellation, but also how to fold any other tessellation that is in the same structure. So there's a ton of different things to get into, like these mixed depth twists that haven't shown up in Tessellation or in Advent of Tess yet, but do show up in Advanced Twist Techniques and Tessellation Academy. This one, for example, only has trapezoid twists, and so that's another fun thing to work on. So with Tessellation Academy, the main focus is not only understanding new structures and how to fold patterns in them, but also learning how to design patterns in those structures. So then you can say, okay, I have, let's take funnel weaver as an example. I have this pattern that's a hexagon with 6 triangles and then 6 hybrid hexagons and 6 more triangles around it. How can I repeat this pattern? And then it's like, well, you could choose to repeat this by treating the 2-fold hybrid hexagon as a position of 2-fold rotational symmetry. What you currently have can do that. Or you can say, I have these 2 pleats coming out here, and those are the same distance away from each other as the 2 pleats coming out here. And if I just stick this whole thing over here, that's going to hook up. And if I do that over here and over here, then I can see what triangle is going to be needed to connect all the pleats that'll be coming into that one place down there. So there's a lot of different ways that each of these guys can be connected. And by the way, I didn't mention there's another pleat parallel to these initial 2 under here. So I could connect on these 2 to these 2, that one underneath, or I could connect these 2 to these 2. So there's even options within the options. And you can come up with all kinds of crazy things. Like you could say, well, this, I like it, but I actually want to repeat it more like Andromeda. So instead of triangles here, I'm going to put rhombus twists. You could do that too. There's really no limit to what you can fold once you have this mindset of, okay, I'm going to take these shapes and I've got these shapes that I'm starting with, but I then want to play with them in this new and interesting way. And all of a sudden you're an origami tessellation designer and you are never lacking for things to do in your free time, because there's always another pattern that could be folded. So that's kind of the end stage of what could happen after Advent of Tess, is if you start playing with these patterns, maybe starting with the Advent of Tess ebook and seeing how I have played with these patterns and how I have made these different variations that repeat in different ways. You could even, and I showed exactly how to do this, you can, in the video on the Advent of Tess ebook back in November, you can take the PDFs from the ebook, open them up in your vector graphics editing software of choice. I use Inkscape, and start playing with the crease patterns. Like, just ungroup stuff and start moving it around. That is totally an option when you're working with these origami tessellations, and particularly these small snippets of patterns that can then be combined in different ways. So that's what I've got to share about how to move forward after completing Advent of Tess. If you've gotten through all of Advent of Tess through day 25, I do recommend trying to fold more repeats of these patterns. If you didn't make it all the way through, particularly if it got really hard right before the hybrid hexagon twists, I'd recommend going back and working on more basic techniques of how to fold repeats with basic twists, and then getting into these more advanced twists. So I do also have a set of free tutorial videos on how to fold more repeats of a variety of structures. I'm going to be adding to that over the next couple months with some of the structures that we just saw in this Advent of Tess. And again, all the links are in the description. Happy folding, and I'll see you next week.